Okay, so I guess the starting point for this session might be that, I mean, how did you even find React? Why did you become a React developer in the first place? What brought you to React? I think you have to unmute first.
The bar disappeared.
Yeah,
it's that's an interesting question. I mean, I didn't start anywhere close to being a React developer, I guess. In fact, I probably put it off for as long as possible for some reason. But a long time ago, maybe 10 years ago, I started off building online casinos with Backbone and Marionette. That was my first developer job.
Yeah.
That was still sort of when jQuery was around. And then I went to work in America for a little bit for CS50, which is Harvard's Introduction to Computer Science. And there they hadn't adopted React yet, but they wanted a video player making. And so went ahead and sort of made my own virtual DOM framework, weird thing. In fact, I didn't use the virtual DOM, but the syntax was pretty similar. But that was all vanilla JS, and I sort of proved to myself that I could do that. I learned a lot building those kind of things, interfaces, I guess. And shortly after that, though, I found a little framework called HyperApp, which is like famously a 1 kilobyte JavaScript framework with view and state management in there. It's kind of takes after Elm in a weird way, or aspires to the single state architecture and things like that. And from then, I went back and forth on frameworks. It was quite an exciting time back then. You know, there was a lot of innovation in that space, a lot more than I think we had now. I think some people complained about it, but since then, React was popularized. It became the lowest common denominator if you're making UIs. And so once hooks came along, it sort of satisfied my functional approach to things. And that's about when I got on board the React train.
Yeah, it's really a big train. I mean, I still remember how we wrote React in the beginning. It's quite different, but I always felt that it's missing this functions will be the building block, and once they did the hooks, now you can use functions for anything you want. Just a little bit about CSS. So, what's your background with CSS? How did you get started with CSS in React? What approaches did you use before?
I mean, I started CSS at the same time I started like HTML, I guess. I always enjoyed laying things out on a page. Like I always like making posters, and before the web it was Photoshop, and that power to, you know, say every text element on the page, please be red or please be blue. That was like, to do that programmatically was quite enticing. So I was immediately taken by CSS, and I probably sunk a lot of time, most of my time, programming time into CSS. And by nature there, I guess, I've tried most approaches, you know, vanilla CSS, Sass, less, post CSS, CSS modules, CSS and JS style components, and more recently, something like, you know, things like Tailwind.
Yeah. But so let's discuss Tailwind a little bit. So for anyone that doesn't know, Tailwind implements this utility-based approach for CSS. So it's sort of like you take utility idea from CSS and JS and put these utilities in HTML. So it's like CSS and JS without JS. It's like sort of one way to put it, maybe. Or how would you describe Tailwind?
It's a set of predefined tokens, I guess, that allow you to describe how things should look on the page. You know, you say BG-red 500, you're going to get a red background.
Yeah, cool. And I guess the issue, at least for me, and likely for you as well, is that with Tailwind, what they provide is this one very big CSS file. And then you use the classes from the CSS file, and then at the end, there is a tool for CSS that's going to eliminate the classes that you don't need. So where did the idea for Oceanwind come from? Why did you decide to write Oceanwind, or what was the background of the project? Like, why to write your own solution for styling?
So I think I probably followed a similar path to you. Like I saw the idea, and you know, at first I was kind of like, oh, this is interesting. Like I think what 5 years ago, I was actually trying to make something called here, like if you can see on the screen, called Prototype,
Yeah, we can
which
make the
does
screen a little bigger, so it's
yeah, everything
with full
like good.
screen.
Yeah. You know, there was this thing called Prototype 5 years ago now, and you know, I had the same sort of idea, right? Like that we could take these things that I was writing all the time. I am still a very slow typer, and abbreviate them to, you know, this is Tailwind on steroids, I guess. Like justify content, space between. It's just the starting letters of each of the things. But I tried to make as many of these as possible, and tried to think about how you could apply them to multiple elements, things like this. And so it was already sort of an idea I'd had. And when I started to see Tailwind get popularized, I thought, this, you know, this is my chance. I can have what I've always wanted. And I imported the CSS file, the base one, the big file. I think it's 2.8 megabytes or something, that has every single possible generated rule in Tailwind rule in one big file. And I just imported it into a local project, and off I went. And it is amazing how productive you can be, right? Just writing class names and having things change shape and size and color. But then it came to the crunch, I guess, where you had to remove all the stuff you didn't want. You don't want to ship 2.8 megabytes of CSS with like a JavaScript app that weighs less than 10 kilobytes or something like that. So then I tried to set up the purge bit, and like immediately my brain went, no. I'm already quite famously against build steps for their like complexity often. And so I wasn't about to sort of implement or introduce a build step to my personal projects just so I could use Tailwind. So in that respect, I didn't really have much option. So I decided to reverse engineer it, like you said at the beginning, flip it on its head.
Yeah, I think that's what happened. So with the implementation, I mean, maybe it's good that we show a demonstration first. So you have this in-browser demo, because so just to tell a little about Oceanwind is that because I started using Oceanwind, and my use case has to do with server-side rendering, and then what happened, I did a small pull request adding this feature, so we can actually use this solution in browser as a runtime, and you can also use it let's say you make a static site, so you could use the solution to generate extremely minimal CSS for every single page. Mm-hmm. But maybe we look at the runtime demonstration so people get the idea of the approach.
Yeah, I mean, there's not much to it, weirdly, you know. When
that's the thing.
Yeah, I mean, this is the beauty of it. So I guess I'll sort of roll it back a tiny bit, and I kind of knew it was possible to like write some code, or like a compiler, if you like, that would take instructions like BG red 500 or BG purple 500, and then translate it into the appropriate key value pairs for CSS. Like by nature, it's atomic. Kind of, it's not strictly atomic Tailwind, but usually you have one directive, I like to call it, like BG white, BG black, and it maps one-to-one to background white or background black. And I actually saw Ocean.
Yeah, but we can make the screen really big again so people can see better.
Oops, I'll just do Ocean. So there's this really cool library that I actually saw just by happenstance on Twitter, I think, and then had a look into it, and it said Atomic CSS with a featherweight runtime. And I thought, wow, if you mix this with the sort of idea I had about this Tailwind language, you could end up with something really cool. And so although Oceanwind is kind of dependency free, I've actually vended a version of this. Thank you, Christoph. And it handles all the applying styles to the web page, if you like, the DOM. And it handled all the server-side rendering for me. So I knew once I had the css-in-js shape, we could add it to the DOM and everything would be good, which pretty much just left translations, right? You have to write something that will take these directives, these BG red 500, I keep using it as an example, but how do you turn this and every other directive in the Tailwind documentation into actual CSS in JS? And we actually sort of did that with the help of one of my colleagues, Phil Buckton, who is a genius for the record. And he wrote this, this sort of CodeGen script here using Babel CodeGen. We were driving it with this grammar file here. Sorry, I'm going to make this bigger again.
Yeah. So how did you come about the grammar? So did you generate the grammar from some existing code, or where did the grammar come from?
Crazily, the grammar was all, like pretty much all of, so everything in comments here came from the Tailwind documentation.
Yeah. So you wrote it by hand. So you had some kind of.
Yeah. No, this bit was painstakingly done by hand. Phil and I sort of I started at the top, he started at the bottom. We took every example from the Tailwind documentation to make sure we covered everything. And here, for example, you can see that border box translates to box sizing border box. Box content is box sizing content. And so
that's the great thing about this approach is that we get this sort of definition of Tailwind without Tailwind. So the project doesn't depend on Tailwind. So it just looks the same, but it has nothing to do with it in the end.
Correct. It uses no code from Tailwind.
So there's no code from Tailwind project.
Yeah. So I mean, Phil, being the genius he has managed to translate these kind of grammars into a big switch statement. That was pretty much the approach we took. I think there's a lot of this. You can see there's a lot of cases. So in the back of my head here, even though I knew this was possible, it's really something you can't prove is possible until you've done everything. You know,
exactly.
Like, so it was quite daunting. And talk about burnout. Like I think I burned out in the middle of this project. There is literally thousands of definitions here. What's interesting about this approach, though, is that like you see all these definitions here, like all these for colors, especially this thing's highlighted here, but all the colors here, instead of having to make hundreds of definitions, the grammar for all colors is just this amount of code. So this is really interesting to see.
Yeah, it's really compact. And if I remember right, I think Tailwind itself is implemented in, I think it's post-CSS plugins or so. So there is no official grammar for Tailwind. And
no, there is not.
Yeah, so they could more or less take the grammar from this project and generate what they have. So, but,
yeah, and I think Adam
of course
has said he's thought about it a few times already.
So in some way, these projects, they might come together one day, or maybe they just adopt this approach and drop the. I mean, maybe that would be even the best. So we would not need merge CSS with Tailwind if they went this way.
Yeah, so we haven't really dug into how it differentiates yet, but you know, we will get onto that, and probably before that, it's useful to see that this is the generated code from that code gen, and you know, like I said before, it's just a big switch statement. What we do is we break up the directives by hyphen separators, and then we count the length of it. So BG red 500 has 3 parts. That means we would go into a lower down switch statement. This switch here is for cases or directives with 1 part. So like hidden will output display none. Static, fixed, absolute, relative, and sticky, they can nicely be sort of combined into position and then the thing that you gave it, the case. So position static, position fixed, position absolute. So when we saw this, it was kind of a relief because we realized it's not going to be as big as we initially thought, which was one of our sort of fears. initially. Yeah, so once that was made, that was like 1,000 lines of code generated for us. It probably covered 90% of the API. I don't know, it's hard to tell. But there were definitely edge cases that were hard to define programmatically. They maybe didn't fit the sort of rules that we'd written. And so I sort of just gave in with the code gen and decided to go through it by hand with a fine-tooth comb and fill in all the rest of the translations and optimize some of the stuff that the code gen had put in sort of naively.
Yeah, and so from this switch case, we go to something that you're passing to Ocean. So maybe you want to show the transformation from this to actual CSS. Maybe that's interesting to understand.
Yeah, so I guess once we'd written all these definitions, we wanted to test it. And so the testing is a good example of what is happening under the hood. So given top auto, we just want to make sure that Oceanwind returns top auto. Given top 0, you want to do top 0. Now, once you have this,
we can make it bigger again so people see.
Yeah, so you go through and test all these cases in isolation, I guess. And then when you add these things together, so this is the main sort of index of the project. This is where it takes input and turns it into output. And it's mostly here. So first we normalize the strings. Here's what this means is like remove any double spaces, because we're in JavaScript land here. So for a start, you feed Oceanwind. This is one way of feeding it directives, is in tag template literals. So here you can see we're feeding it font sans serif, width full, height, whatever this definition is, item center, justify center. So what Oceanwind will do is first like take this big multi-line string and just turn it into an array of directives of what it thinks it needs to process. It does that here. Then we go through each rule. We say if we've seen the rule or not. And then we split out directive from variants. So variants, if you don't know, are like media queries. So you could write bg red, and that will only apply background red on small screens. So anything before colons essentially are variants. You could also do things like hover. So this would only apply background red and hover. We split out those things, and then we go ahead and translate any of each directive according to some provided theme. If we don't find a translation, we warn the user. Then we apply the variants. Then we return a translation. So now we have a list of translations. Like you used to have BG Red 500, now you have background colon and a hex number.
Yeah, expanded, yeah.
Yeah, and so once you have all these separated in an array, I just go through and merge all of these things into one big CSS and JS object. And it's at this point that Ocean takes over. So you can imagine now, you know, we have a readable stream. Obviously, that's what I wanted. Text color, whatever. And we just want this adding to the DOM, and we want a class name. That's all I want now. And Ocean does this really well. It literally goes through each of these CSS and JS rules and creates a class name for it. So we can see that, probably see that in action better in the browser.
Yeah, one thing I was thinking about, actually, I mentioned about it in the issue tracker, is that how we might use CSS variables. So maybe this will be the place, because let's say I want to add theming on top of Oceanwind. I would like to inject this CSS variable tokens and then control the variables later somehow. I guess that will be the spot or so.
Yeah, I mean, luckily for us, Ocean supports CSS variables, and Tailwind do use them in their implementation. They do it for special rules like transform, which might have multiple parts. And so instead of creating all the different variations of transforms that are possible, they actually just apply one transform rule with scale, translate, rotate, and whatever. And then they use the CSS variables to inject the appropriate values into each of those directives. That was a weird thing to actually try emulate without CSS variables, but I did it in a weird, hacky way. But here's probably a good example of everything sort of happening in a row. I just tried it earlier and it seems to work. So first we're going to await the import of Oceanwind from unpackage, and we'll call that O. Hopefully you can see that. So now we have an O, I believe, and you can see it's a module, which is fine. And we use O default, the default export, and we know that the default export will take a list of directives, right? Like BG, white. Now, if I hit enter, Oceanwind is going to process just these directives. Like at the moment, let's pretend nothing exists on the page. There are no CSS rules anywhere. But if I click this, it returns a string. This string is a space delimited string, and it contains two class names. Just like in CSS and JS, these class names scope over some styles, right? So we could probably actually see that. If I took these, like, how do we know what's in it? And this is another issue I think you raised on the repo, is like we gave in this very clear human readable directives, and we got out this sort of gibberish, which isn't actually much use to us. But when we apply it to an element, you can see we now have background white and the text is black. So that's what that gets translated to. The instructions, the CSS behind these are already added to the DOM in the top here in this Ocean style tag here.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the amazing things about the approach I noticed is that what you get is very compact. So it's not going to give you a lot of CSS in the end. Because
it will only give you enough CSS to satisfy the requirements, right?
Yeah, exactly. So you get the minimum amount of CSS, and that led me to think that maybe we don't even have to worry about like this critical CSS or certain techniques, because you don't have much CSS to begin with. So
no, and I mean, what's even crazier is that so let's say you had 1,000 elements on the page that all had background red 500. You would think, oh well, maybe that it's generated 1,000 class names for this, like, because each one's unique and each one's cached. But the way Ocean works is it would check to see if it's already got a rule for background red. And if it has, it will just reuse that class name. So it'll just return that class name as part of the string. You'll only end up with one class for all those 1,000 items.
Yeah, that's like really amazing, because you end up it's just really the minimum amount of classes and CSS. So then it's just the output is great. I noticed that you added some new feature to the library just a while ago. So you started playing with the syntax. Maybe you want to show that?
Yeah. So like once I'd hit reasonable feature parity, like the API is always changing, and it's hard to keep up. Like if you find something that's missing, please do just create an issue and we'll create a translation for it. But so once you've done that, you can start to go into cool stuff that isn't necessarily possible with a traditional Tailwind approach. First thing there in this regard is probably the function signature. So this was another thing you're inspired by yourself, Before I just supported this, like these backticks, and you could pass in a set of rules. You could do it on the multi-line. Everything was good. And I thought, well, quite naturally, you should be able to support interpolation. So we did that. Then you said that you were using arrays quite a lot to pass in rules, which I can see as a sensible use case. So we decided to support that. While we were at it, I thought, let's sort of filter out faulty values so that you could do something similar to this. It's quite commonly seen with object syntax, whereby you pass a rule and then whether it should be applied or not. So in this case, both rules should be applied, and in this one, rounded should be ignored.
Yeah. So
nice,
about this, do you think it's useful for React developers? So how is it will be something like this to integrate to a React project? So let's say we want to use Oceanwind with React.
Yeah, so let's just have a look at that. Oh, it's up here. I made this demo for that. I mean, this demo uses Preact, which is what I've been almost exclusively building applications out of these days. But you can see we import render and HTML, and then we import Oceanwind here. I take this themed version. I extend the theme with rotate 5, just so I can use it later. It's more an example of that. Example of an abstracted style here. An example of a render. So here you can just see that we put the O call, the call to Oceanwind, just inside the class name as a class name prop. And that will get turned into that string that I showed you earlier, which already has appended the styles to the style tag at the top of the page. And so you will see the results here. One more thing to note here is that because we can choose the syntax inside of here, we're not limited by like class name, general class name structures or syntax. We can nest things like this. So usually you would have had to write hover colon rotate 5, hover colon state 150, hover colon cursor pointer. But here I've written a little normalizer that essentially expands that a bit like in math, where you would multiply that by that, that by that, that by that. And that's what ends up getting applied here. So when we hover over, those 3 rules get applied.
Yeah, it's really cool because I think there's some room for expansion and for playing around with the syntax. And my feeling is that it will be easy to integrate to different environments, not just React. I mean, I use it in something that's not React, and it was very, very simple to do.
Yeah, so, I mean, on the in the docs, I tried to emphasize that this is completely framework agnostic. It literally just takes some strings and returns you some more strings. With a side effect of adding some styles to the DOM, which can, as you have demonstrated here, be abstracted out and then server-side rendered, which essentially abstracts away all the runtime costs that people might be scared of generally.
I mean that's the amazing thing, that it's I mean, it's compact, it's performant. I mean, what will be interesting to know is what's the kind of the cost. I mean, because every time you use some CSS solution, there is some cost related to generating the CSS. But I don't know if there is any benchmark or so.
I remember Phil did do some benchmarks, and he was quite impressed. Like, I think he pretty much made style components along with some other people, so he knew what to expect. And I do remember him being quite surprised. But I think that's next on the list, is just to prove that this has desirable perf characteristics, I guess, at scale.
Yeah, and my feeling was that there's some room for improving the solution, because we can maybe memorize some parts or cache some results.
Very under optimized. There's also almost no optimization. It's just the raw transforms going on at the moment. I think caching directives and
it's even. So I guess we move on to the Q&A. So thanks for the session. I hope people learned about the approach and how it goes together and try it. So I guess we move on to the poll results now. So what's your preferred starting solution with React? And at least for me, it's a little surprising that half responded that they just use vanilla CSS, and then one. I mean, I think it's 8 people responding, but still 25% use Sass and 25 some other approach. And what's surprising for me is that nobody is using css-in-js in this case. I guess if more people answered, that will go up, but it's that's the biggest surprise. How about do you notice anything weird yourself here, or what would you expect?
Yeah, I think people are still using preprocessors like in a build step mostly. Yeah. CSS before any of this sort of kicked off. I think CSS modules was still my preferred approach. I just like the scoping. That's all I really want. I still kind of liked writing normal CSS. I didn't like writing quotes around all my rules and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's somehow great to have like markup. I mean, HTML and CSS and logic, even logic in the same file and in the same markup. So it's like let's smash everything together and try to keep the definition there. It seems that's at least that's the way for me. But yeah.
I think the problem with CSS and JS for me is like I've seen it on massive projects where it's been utilized a lot, and it starts to become like death by 1,000 paper cuts. You know, for a start, it seems really good, but
yeah, I mean, you get started first. There's some render cost in React because it's going to add it can add some complexity to the render tree, unless you use certain solutions to work around that. But I've seen it affect performance in some cases.
Yeah, definitely deeply styled trees. Yeah, that was the specific case that sort of put me off eventually.
Yeah. So I feel that solutions like Oceanwind, they sort of hit a good balance between the ergonomics of css-in-js and still like having styling in your markup.
I mean, the one thing I don't think I'm alone in thinking this, but one of the biggest benefits for me is quite literally being able to like copy and paste a bit of markup from one component into another component, and then reload, and it looks exactly the same because it comes with all the styles right there. Like the amount of time you realize how much commonality there is between bits of code that you write, tiny bits of code, and even
that's really the cool thing, especially with like that's sort of the selling point of Tailwind, is that you can just copy the code. It's going to work. It's going to look the same. It's going to look what you expect. So.
And then if you take advantage of something like HTM, which is doing JSX at runtime as well, then you're really in sort of copy pastable land. You need 2 imports at the top of your file, and you can copy and paste any amount of JSX and styles through Oceanwind.
So what's your feeling about JSX? Is JSX here to stay, or do you think we see some competition in terms of writing markup?
I think historically I've always been on the anti-JSX, in the anti-JSX camp. I don't know. I still write it every day. Like I think it's just because everybody else does, but I've created a few alternatives myself, like using sort of tuple kind of syntax, or just going straight back to functions. I think it's important to remember that JSX just compiles down to react.createElement or preact.h.
Yeah, it's going to change with React 17 or it changed. So it's not generating React create element anymore, but something else.
I have heard of this, but I haven't looked into it yet.
Yeah, so let's see if it's some innovation in this space. And one of the things I was thinking about is that you could more or less write the user interface in generic JSON. There is this no-code solution, and they use JSON as intermediate format. And then from this JSON to describe user interface, they generate code for React and Vue and Angular or whatever. So it's sort of, you end up with this meta language to describe your components, which seems kind of interesting idea, at least for tooling.
Certainly, I mean, I say it's important to remember that JSX compiles down to React.createElement, but React.createElement compiles down to just virtual DOM objects.
Yeah.
They're pretty standard. I mean, annoyingly, there isn't a standard for the virtual DOM yet. Like, there's the shape of your object. They're all very similar. You know, React and Preact are by nature going to be nearly identical. And I remember, you know, during the early days of HyperApp, we came across this sort of thing and thought, well, why isn't there a standard for it? Why can't we describe the DOM across frameworks? And then you could get into this weird like LLVM world where you could crush views down to this low level standard and then pull it back up in any flavor of engine you want, like React, Preact, Vue, anything like that. I think we're definitely getting closer to that point.
Yeah, I guess the next question is, should browsers implement virtual DOM? So if you had some kind of standard and push that to browser.
Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, it's it's a tough one, isn't it? But when you look at the likes of Preact, there's 3 kilobytes of code that we could just ship with every browser. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's too much responsibility there. I would rather see a spec made for a virtual DOM object, and then people can build big or engines, big or small, out of that, and just consume these type of objects.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing. How much can you integrate into browser? And let's say you decide we're going to put it to standard, and that is going to take 5 to 10 years to have in enough places. So
yeah, it's going to be tough. Yeah. And yeah, I don't know. If I'm quite honest, I think we've spent a long time on like render, the render process and views, but this is just one part. Like if you ask me, that we still have the uphill battle of figuring out state management. Myself, I've always found that way harder, and it's like we just jumped the state management thing and went straight to render and tried to optimize the hell out of that. Frankly, putting state inside renders is something that scares me. So although I like hooks and their functional approach, I'm still wary of it. I still kind of like this single state approach.
Yeah, I mean, this year what I actually did, I did exactly that. So first thing I did, I dropped virtual DOM for my personal work, or for my experiment. There's no virtual DOM. I think it's more than enough for the type of components I'm doing. I think you will need it still for something heavy like a table returning kind of updates. And there you need virtualization anyway. So I think but for my feeling is that for most rendering, you might be able to go without virtual DOM and then use it in specific cases, not for everything. I mean, it might be like one approach to try. But I think we're almost out of time. So thanks for the talk. I think we learned a lot, and maybe we see in Rec Finland one day. You never know.
In real life.
Yeah. Bye.
Perfect. Thank you.